Hello again, and welcome back to Politics and Societies of Southeast Europe. In this part of this week's presentation, I'm going to try to give you a bit of background to the study of the region and try to frame some of the major issues and some of the major problems that we're going to be approaching during this term. I think the best place to begin is on the general. That is in talking about the area of Southeast Europe and what we mean when we say area studies. And I suppose the first thing we ought to say about area studies is that this is a field. It's what all of us do in CEES and in related institutions that are dedicated to the study of a particular part of the world. This is a category and it's a field that has become somewhat contested. I mean, you could argue that it's contested from the beginning, that the reason that area studies programs were created in the first place was to enable the recruitment by governments of powerful international states of experts um, in the lives and structures and problems of less powerful states in the world. And there was a long time where SEES, the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, where I worked, was known more or less as the spy school. What our job was to give language training and basic political knowledge to people who would work in areas like intelligence. But a strange thing happened along the way. This spy school reputation is really a relic of the Cold War. The Cold War ended, and with it, probably you also saw the end of the reason for the existence of a category like Eastern Europe. What is the point of dividing Europe into East and West, and what are the distinctions between them, and are these meaningful anymore? This is a problem that we're all faced in doing area studies, and one way of approaching this problem increasingly has been to say, well, we don't necessarily need to think of areas only as political categories or as geographic descriptions, that we might begin to think of areas as places with shared identities, shared problems, shared histories. But the first way in which we define an area is geographically. So you want Southeast Europe. Here you have on the map Southeast Europe with a little bit of Eastern Europe. The part we're talking about in Southeast is in this area toward the bottom of the map, reaching from Albania a little bit east into Macedonia, Bulgaria, and Romania, across to Slovenia. So that is one way of thinking about the region of Southeast Europe, that is, as a definable geographical space in the world with geographic boundaries made up of states. There are some other ways that we can think of the region, however, and of the distinctiveness of the region. Another way might be to think of the region as made up of a set of legacies, and part of what makes the history and even the current societies of Southeast Europe so interesting is the historical legacy that it has, particularly its history as a place in which empires contested for dominance on over the eastern and southern part of Europe, and in particular from the 14th century onward, this was the site of contestation between the two large European empires, the Ottoman Empire on the one hand, which controlled. This is a map from 1714, but the borders shifted at different times, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, controlling most of the northern and western half of the area most of the time. And these two empires, first of all, the competition between them created historical legacies that are still meaningful in the life of the region now. Second, each of them had administrative and social and political systems which have left their traces and which continue to influence life and the demographic structure of the states in the region. And third, even now, many of the political and social attitudes that are dominant in states of the region are structured by competing attitudes toward the legacies of these empires. Okay, so we can think of empires or of areas not only as being constituted by geographic space, but also as being constituted by historical memory, historical legacies, by shared experience and competition over the meaning of that experience. We can also talk about another way in which historical legacies are important, and this is an historical legacy that developed during the 20th century, but probably continues to be meaningful, and that is the legacy of the Cold War. We tend to talk about the states of Southeast Europe as being part of the post-communist or post-socialist world, and this is a term that is often regarded as meaningful. Sometimes it is contested, but there is something important about the position that the states of the region occupied during the Cold War that sets their historical experience apart from the rest of what was, for a time, the land of European socialism, what was called real socialism, or of state socialism, if you prefer. And that is, for the most part, Europe was divided during the Cold War into Eastern and Western blocs that competed for power and dominance. These states that you see in red, or I suppose that's more salmon or steelhead trout, and in pink are the ones that were a part of the bloc controlled by the Soviet Union. Most of them ended up with communist governments because these governments were imposed by the Soviet Union. There are only two states in Europe where communist governments came to power as a result of a military victory by domestic forces against what by the end of the war was mostly German occupation, and those two states were Yugoslavia and Albania. And so they form a different history after 1945 when the Cold War begins. Yugoslavia breaks with the Soviet Union in 1948, establishes a kind of position as a third force in Europe, a socialist state that is not a part of the pro-Soviet bloc, ends up founding, along with Egypt and Indonesia, the non-aligned movement of states trying to seek to avoid domination by either the Eastern or Western blocs. Albania takes a different path. It also breaks with the Soviet Union in 1950, develops a set of alliances for a period up until about 1968. Albania is allied with China, is the only ally of China in Europe. After breaking with China, Albania develops its own form of domestically structured and constituted state socialism, which, in contrast with the one in Yugoslavia that seeks a position in between East and West, in Albania the communists in power sought to develop a state that was more purely communist and Marxist-Leninist than the Soviet states. It was for a period of time the only officially atheist state in the world, and as a result, during the period of the Cold War, if Yugoslavia was a site of contestation, the place where East and West met and carried out spy operations and other sorts of interesting things, Albania was in a large measure isolated during this period. So the effect of this legacy has been to develop attitudes toward the state socialist past in both Yugoslavia and Albania, which are distinct from one another and are also distinct from the kinds of attitudes that developed in the other parts of the ex-state socialist world in Europe, those states where governments had been put in that were during the period of the Cold War mostly dominated to greater or lesser extent by the Soviet Union. Now, If we want to understand some of the relatively unique experience of Southeast Europe, there are probably some basic background facts that it's essential to always keep in mind. First, as I've alluded to already, its experience of empire was fairly unique. It was a site of contestation between two large empires, and empires with very distinct political and social systems that they imposed. Its experience of independence was also unique, including the creation of federal states based on an idea of common identity, and even where national states were formed, like in Albania, the form of nationalism was distinct from the sort of nationalism that developed in other states, and particularly because in Albania, the nationalism that developed is conceptually separate from religion. Second, throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, Southeast Europe, like pretty much every other part of the world, underwent an experience of intense modernization, but there are some ways in which the experience of modernization was relatively unique, and I think relatively unique because it was interrupted in several instances by frequent wars and other conflicts. In some periods, it was ideologically directed, and when it went at its fastest pace, particularly in the second half of the 20th century, it was very rapid and it was socially incomplete, so that modern cities were created that failed to integrate their populations entirely, resulting in an approach to modernity that is the site of a lot of contemporary conflict in the region too. Third, something that you probably already know, the experience of the 20th century. The 20th century was a difficult century for most of the world, but this is maybe a trivial thing to say. Every century is a difficult century for most of the world. I'd say the 20th century in Southeast Europe was traumatic because of the destructive characters of both the major wars that involved most of the world, World War I and World War II, and because of the wars for territorial independence and statehood that followed the end of the Cold War in the states of the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. And not only was the experience of war traumatic, but like in the rest of the region, what we call the CEE region, the experience of socialism and contemporary relations to the experience of socialism make up an important part of people's understanding of themselves and their positions and of the goals of states. But the experience of socialism in the states of Southeast Europe was mostly atypical. It was unique in relation to the experience of socialism elsewhere. Although I think anybody specialists in other parts of the post-socialist world will tell you that the experience of socialism was relatively unique everywhere. And finally, if we look at contemporary questions and contemporary disputes in the area, current political history and recent political history is subject to intense contestation and differing interpretations, many of which are mutually exclusive. So a lot of the fights that go on, both in the field of ideas and sometimes actual fights in the region, are fights about historical truth and the meaning of historical truth. Uh, Finally, I'll make just one point that will be a bit of a preview for next week. Is what is the biggest problem in understanding the region? I would say this is the region that's referred to as the Balkans, after the mountain range that is the dominant mountain range in the region. The term Balkan and its transformation into the verb to balkanize has become a stereotypical way of understanding the region, in particular of understanding a region as having a kind of unique relation to modernity that is defined by incompleteness, and of understanding it as being a site of ethnically based and identity based dispute that is somehow irretrievable. What I'm going to suggest is that regardless of a question of whether societies are divided, whether modernity is a problem, whether identity is a site of confrontation, this Balkan idea functions as a kind of stereotype. And it is a stereotype that probably does more to interfere with than to contribute to understanding of the region. But I'm only going to say that much for now as a bit of preview, because the Balkan stereotype and the interesting application of the strategy of Orientalism, which some people like the historian Mario Todorova have defined as Balkanism, is going to be our topic for next week, and we're going to go into it in a lot more detail then. So that is all the presentation that I have for this week, and I will look forward to meeting with you virtually and discussing with you at our session on Monday. Okay.